Although virtue theory is an appealing theory, it does have some problems. One classic problem is specifying the virtues. Those who criticize virtue theory claim that virtue theorists tend to be rather vague about the virtues, and they also tend not to justify the acceptance of the virtues. And the bite of the criticism is that without such a justification, there would seem to be little or no reason to accept the theory. Now, not surprisingly, virtue theorists have replies to these concerns. The first is that almost everyone intuitively accepts that the virtues are, in fact, virtues. And this is taken as indicating that the virtues describe objectively desirable qualities. As such, there's no special need to provide such a justification. Another way to look at it is that the burden of proof rests not on those who claim the virtues are desirable or good, rather it's on those who would claim that they are in fact not. Second point of concern is that some claim that, ironically, virtue theory is self-focused, it's selfish. How so? Well, the emphasis seems to be on developing one's own virtues, and this seems to make virtue theory a selfish theory. It's all about me and my virtues. Not surprisingly, the virtue theorists have a fairly easy to reply here. Many of the virtues, such as generosity, involve others. Kindness involves others, loyalty involves others. As such, the virtues do not seem to be inherently selfish. And typically, with the notable exception of Ayn Rand and her view that virtue is a selfishness, or rather selfishness is a virtue, selfishness is typically regarded as being a vice. And so it seems that the virtue theorist can handle this objection. Now, a third objection is a concern about totalitarianism. Totalitarianism is the view that the government, the ruling power, should have total control over people's lives, hence totalitarianism. Now, one standard objection is that virtue theory leads to totalitarianism. The idea is that with this focus on developing virtues, virtue theory would seem to be aimed at creating a uniform society with no diversity. And this criticism is especially relevant to Aristotle, as we'll see in the part on moral education, Aristotle argued that the state should forcibly impose moral education on its citizens and compel them to be good and to regulate every aspect of their lives. Now, the concern is, of course, that diversity is regarded by some as a moral good, and attempting to make everyone the same would seem wrong. Also, the idea of compelling or forcing people to be good seems to be objectionable. So basically, two main concerns here. One is that it seems to be imposing on people, and it seems to be wrong to do so. And second, there are concerns about the state taking total control of people's lives. Now, the virtue theorists have a couple of replies to this. One is that developing the virtues would seem to be no more likely to make people uniform, all the same, than developing athletic ability or music ability would. That when people become virtuous, just as they become healthy or athletic, they could do so in their own individual ways. And so there's no need for this monotonous uniformity. And of course, a second reply is that totalitarianism can be seen as not virtuous, but as a viceful system of rule, that it imposes too much on people, it's excessive. Now, a third reply, which is one Aristotle could help himself to, is that the imposition of virtue is morally acceptable. In other words, making people good is the right thing to do. And so there are ways the virtue theorist could reply to that objection. Now, a fourth concern is the matter of conflicting virtues. Virtues can, obviously enough, come into conflict with each other. For example, you can imagine someone in a class, and they're going to take the test, and a friend of theirs has not studied, and the friend whispers to them, "Hey, I didn't study. Can you help me with my test?" Now, the person seems to be in a conflict because the virtue of honesty would prevent one from cheating, because cheating would be dishonest and wrong. But the virtue of loyalty says that you have to aid your friends. And so there'd be a conflict between being honest and not cheating and the obligation to help one's friend. And that would create a conflict. And the problem that it is claimed is that virtue theory can't resolve that because the virtues are in conflict. Now, virtue theorists have an easy reply here. The first is based on the principle that what is a problem for all theories cannot be a problem for any particular theory. To use an analogy, if there are candidates applying for a job and they all say lack a particular skill, while that would be a defect for all of them, it could not be used as a particular reason to reject a particular one, because they all have that defect. And not surprisingly, almost all moral theories face a similar problem of conflict, where one moral, guide or principle or rule runs afoul of another. The obvious exception, of course, is a morally absolute theory. In that case, there are no exceptions, so no problem with conflict. There is always one and one correct answer. So the first reply essentially is it's a problem for almost everyone, so it's not a special problem for virtue theory. True, it's a problem, but not especially problematic for virtue theory. A second reply is that virtue theorists can address that problem by determining which virtue should take precedence, which is more important in that particular case. Also, a way to look at it is, it may be the case that the virtues seem to be in conflict, but it can be resolved. For example, in the case of the conflict between honesty and loyalty to one's friend, it could very well be the case that being loyal to one's friend, somewhat, oddly, requires not helping them cheat, because doing so would be bad for them and would lead them into vice. And so the virtue theorist has ways of addressing the problem of conflicting virtues. A fifth problem is a problem of guides. Critics point out that virtue theory talks about things like don't be excessive, don't be deficient, hit the mean, etc., etc. And so a criticism is that it fails to provide adequate guides for action. So being told to be brave doesn't tell you how to act specifically, say, during a mugging or during war. And so a point of concern is virtue theory, for all its appeal, just seems too vague. Now the virtue theorist can reply in the following way, as Aristotle himself did. Aristotle noted that ethics is a science, but not an exact science. And so you can't give people, particular exacting rules as to what they should do in every situation. However, once a person develops their virtues, they will understand how to act in those cases. To use the obvious analogy, when one takes driver's ed, a person does not receive training in every single possible situation, like what to do if you're driving down Main Street and a green Volkswagen cuts you off at 32 miles an hour and the temperature is 72 degrees. You don't get that sort of exact rules. Rather, you learn how to drive. And that way, hopefully, you can handle most situations that come up. Likewise, when someone develops their virtues, that includes understanding how to act in situations. True, a person may be mistaken, may screw up, just like with driving, but the development of virtues, like the development of other skills, enables one to handle those situations. The final problem is the problem of moral luck. The virtuous life, as put forth by someone like Aristotle, would seem to require a lot of stuff. Being healthy, having a society that supports or at least permits the development of virtue, having all that, all those factors in place. But these seem to be a matter of luck, beyond the control of the individual. And the ability to be a good person should be something under the person's control. Much as Aristotle himself argued when he rejected honor as the good on the grounds that honor depends too much on others. And so it would seem to be a problem, because if being virtuous seems to be a matter of luck, that seems to be sort of a problematic theory. Now, one reply is, of course, that luck, sort of like in sports, kind of balances out. And so it's not simply a matter of luck. And it can also be noted that people can overcome difficult circumstances. And Aristotle himself notes that overcoming adversity is something even more praiseworthy. He doesn't take virtue to be an easy or simple thing, a very difficult thing. Now, of course, the luck argument could be made about any attempt to be successful at anything, such as athletics, business, education, etc. And although luck is clearly a factor, whatever we mean by luck, it's clearly the case that people can overcome that. And so virtue theory does have a variety of problems that it can reply to, and so it still seems to be an appealing theory, but of course has some problems. Next, we'll take a look at religion and ethics.